What really happened that day? In the days that followed, the police honed in on Terry Horman. The last person to see Kyron, Terry's actions raised red flags. Her behavior and statements did not align with what the investigators expected.
Told him as much, but he's not very good at listening sometimes. Just whatever you can make up at the time. Just make sure, just tell them everything's fine if they ask. That's what I was told to say.
What seemed like a simple school day turned into a complex web of suspicions, allegations, and unanswered questions. For Kyron's parents, Kyron Horman and Desiree Young, the emotional stakes couldn't have been higher. As each day went by without answers, their hopes for finding Kyron alive began to dwindle, replaced by an unrelenting grief that no parent should ever face. The investigation would go on for years, with no clear answers about where Kyron was, or who, if anyone, was responsible for his disappearance. This case has stretched on for over 15 years, leaving the family and the public with a single haunting question. What happened to Kyron? His parents' pain, their tireless pursuit of the truth, and the ongoing uncertainty define the emotional core of this case. Now let's dive into the investigation and the twists that have made this case one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime history. On the morning of June 4th, 2010, Kyron Horman was like any other excited 7-year-old preparing for a special day at school. It was Science Fair Day at Skyline Elementary School, a moment he had been looking forward to for weeks. Kyron had spent hours putting together his project, a diorama of a red-eyed tree frog.
He walked into school with a project and a smile, and by the time the day ended, 7-year-old Kyron Horman had disappeared. If you want first-hand updates as investigators re-examine evidence and new leads surface, hit subscribe and turn on your bell so you don't miss what comes next. June 4, 2010 was supposed to be an ordinary school day marked by a small, proud ritual, the science fair. Children set up cardboard landscapes, papier-mâché creatures and model volcanoes. Parents and teachers moved through the room nodding and smiling. For Kyron, the day was special because he had worked hard on a diorama and was ready to show it off. That morning at Skyline Elementary looked unremarkable in the way that safe, ordinary mornings do. The sound of sneakers on linoleum, the murmur of excited children, a parent taking a quick photo before heading back to the car. That photograph, taken of Kyron beside his project, is more than an image. It became the fixed before that the rest of the investigation would orbit around. A child visible, happy, and present at school in the morning. A child missing by afternoon. When a disappearance begins within the walls of a school, it complicates everything. Schools are places designed to account for children. Routines, attendance, bus manifests, parent pickups, are the safety systems we trust. The fact that Kyron vanished on Science Fair Day turned those routines into a timeline investigators had to reconstruct piece by piece. Who saw him at what time? Which teachers remember assisting him? Were there visitors? Any slip in recollection, any gap in surveillance, and those precious minutes become fog. In Kyron's case, that morning image anchored questions that investigators would return to again and again. Whom did he see? Which route did he take, and what happened in the hours between that photo and the moment he should have been arriving home? The photograph also did something else. It humanized the urgency. It's one thing to read about a missing child in a case file, it's another to see the wide, childlike eyes and the small hands arranging a school project. For the family, every reuse of that image reopened a wound. For the community, the picture became a call to action, an emblem of a life abruptly suspended. And for investigators, it was a focal point, the last public proof that Kyron had been at Skyline, where he had been standing, and that he had not yet returned home. The last confirmed adult to see Kyron that morning was his stepmother, Terry Horman. She accompanied him to school, took that photograph, and left while the day continued. When someone who is a caregiver is also the last person known to be with a child, investigators naturally focus time and resources on clarifying that person's account. Being last does not equate to guilt, but it does make that person central to reconstructing timelines. Investigators needed to know precisely where she went, who she spoke with, and whether any of that movement could place her near Kyron during the critical window after the photo and before dismissal. What raised questions for both law enforcement and the public were reported inconsistencies in Terry's accounts and the choices she made that day. Among them, leaving the school before the disappearance was noticed and not immediately joining searches. When witnesses or involved adults give differing versions of events, detectives must determine whether those differences reflect shock, confusion, poor memory, or deliberate obfuscation. Each possibility requires a different investigatory approach, checking phone logs, verifying receipts, reviewing surveillance footage, and comparing statements from others at the school. From the outside, inconsistencies invite suspicion. In the investigative process, they become prompts for concrete corroboration. Another factor that compounded the delay in recognizing Kyron's disappearance was routine paperwork and bus records. That afternoon, the expected return home did not happen, but because of an attendance error and confusion over bus manifests, the absence was not immediately obvious. Even small administrative slips, a box not checked, an attendance sheet misread, a bus roll incorrectly marked, can have outsized consequences. Schools rely on tightly run systems to know who is present at any moment. When that system falters, detection of an absence can be delayed by hours, and those hours are often the most critical in cases involving children. Because of the uncertainty and the passage of time during those early hours, search efforts scaled quickly. Local law enforcement mobilized first, walking neighborhoods, canvassing routes, interviewing school staff and students. As the case grew in complexity and concern, Multnomah County resources expanded and the FBI became involved to offer investigative support, follow leads beyond local jurisdictional lines, and coordinate broader search and forensic capabilities. Volunteers poured into the effort. Neighbors, churches, community organizations, and trained search teams crisscrossed parks, ravines, and nearby terrain for any sign. Despite the scale of the mobilization and the emotional, tireless work of those volunteers and agencies, nothing decisive was found in those early searches that could point the investigation in a single, prosecutable direction. Public attention sharpened when questions about Terry's behavior and cooperation surfaced. Reports described her leaving school after dropping Kyron off and not immediately remaining to assist. Later accounts said she provided statements that investigators found inconsistent. Her demeanor and movements sparked scrutiny and suspicion from the community. The line between stunned composure and suspicious calm is thin to outside observers, and in cases like this the public often reads behavior through a moral lens. Parents are expected to be visibly distraught. Investigators, by contrast, look for evidence that ties a person's account to objective facts. In Terry's case, the inconsistencies prompted more intensive probing of where she was and what she did during windows of time that mattered most to the case. Compounding public scrutiny were reports that Terry failed multiple polygraph exams and declined or refused others. Lie detector testing is controversial and scientifically imperfect. Results are not admitted as definitive evidence in most courts because physiological responses can be influenced by stress, confusion, or the phrasing of questions. Still, in the court of public opinion, failed polygraphs are often equated with guilt. Law enforcement treated such results as triggers for further inquiry rather than proof of wrongdoing, seeking to corroborate any suggested leads with physical evidence, witness statements, or digital records. Terry and her supporters argued that the testing conditions and emotional environment of the investigation could produce false positives and that the tests did not substitute for solid forensic evidence. The legal aftermath included a civil lawsuit filed by Kyron's biological mother, Desiree Young, against Terry Horman. The suit sought to compel testimony and accountability, an extraordinary family escalation driven by desperation for answers. Civil litigation can be a tool to force public disclosure of facts and to obtain sworn testimony that might otherwise be withheld, but it carries risks. Officials warned that aggressive civil maneuvers could interfere with criminal investigations by generating publicity, creating testimonial conflicts, or even precluding certain uses of evidence. The suit generated headlines and heated debate, but it ultimately was dismissed in 2012, leaving the family without the legal breakthrough they had hoped for. Investigators also used grand jury processes to gather testimony and consider whether probable cause existed to bring charges. Grand juries are designed to examine evidence confidentially and to issue indictments when the legal threshold is met. Over time, multiple grand jury inquiries were reported, yet no indictment emerged. The absence of criminal charges underscores a fundamental problem investigators and prosecutors faced: a lack of corroborated, admissible physical evidence or reliable witness testimony that would satisfy the legal standard for prosecution. No matter how intense suspicion may be, the justice system requires more than that. It demands evidence that can be proven in court. Media coverage and public attention kept Kyron's name alive and maintained pressure on authorities to continue the search. Newspapers, television programs, and online channels repeatedly revisited the case, re-examined timelines, and interviewed family members and investigators. That sustained spotlight kept tips flowing and ensured the case did not quietly fade from public consciousness. Yet media intensity has a double edge. While it can surface leads, it can also amplify rumor, pressure investigators, and complicate private grief. For the family, each news cycle reopened wounds, and for the investigators, the flood of tips sometimes required sifting through noise to find actionable information. 15 years after the disappearance, the case remains unsolved and the emotional fallout profound. The lack of physical evidence, no reliable forensic trail, no body, no confession that could be used in court, prevented criminal charges and left many questions unanswered. Family relationships were strained and fractured under the pressure of grief and public suspicion. Custody changes, divorces, and rifts followed as part of the human cost of an unresolved loss. For the community, Kyron's absence became a persistent ache, a reminder that even with exhaustive searches, federal support, and intense public interest, some cases remain stubbornly opaque. Takeaways are stark and sobering. Rapid response matters, but speed alone does not guarantee resolution. Administrative processes, attendance tracking, bus records, and communication protocols are critical safety nets that must work flawlessly. Suspicious behavior and inconsistent statements can fuel long-term public suspicion, but suspicion by itself cannot substitute for evidence required to secure convictions. Legal tools such as civil suits and grand juries are powerful but not always decisive when physical proof is lacking. Media attention sustains pressure and can generate leads, but it cannot produce the kind of tangible evidence courts require. Finally, unresolved cases need continued vigilance. Fresh eyes, new tips, and technological advances in forensics can sometimes unlock what once seemed impossible. Kyron Horman walked into his school on a June morning and vanished from the life he knew. 15 years of searching, legal battles, and public debate have not produced the definitive answer his family deserves. The absence left in the wake of that day is the core of this story, a human tragedy that tests investigative systems, community bonds, and the limits of what evidence can reveal. Keep asking questions, keep the case in view, and treat unresolved disappearances with steady attention and compassion. Every new tip, every re-examined piece of evidence, and every person who refuses to forget brings the possibility, however slim, of closure closer. If you have information that could help, contact the appropriate investigators. And if you follow this story, subscribe and turn on your bell to stay updated.